Hello, this is Reid from the University of Auckland. Thank you for joining me for a talk about osteoporosis. I'll talk about the nature of the problem of osteoporosis, what it leads to in terms of fractures, and then talk about what strategies we have available for reducing the risk of fractures in osteoporosis. Let's start by looking at some bone up close, and this is a section through a normal human shoulder joint, and you can see that the ends of long bones have a very open meshwork pattern, which is what we call trabecular bone. We can zoom in on that more closely, and here we see a very high-powered version of bone, and this time taken from just above the hip joint at the so-called iliac crest. And if you focus on this bone, you can see that most of the bone surface is smooth and there's not much cellular activity taking place at those smooth bone sites, but it's not all smooth, and so in the bottom central part we see that there is a deep hole that's been dug out of bone, and that's dug out by a group of bone resorbing cells, and that process at that particular site probably started about a week before this particular picture was taken. And every day about 20,000 of these resorption sites come into existence dotted across the surface of our skeleton, and over the next week all of us will have 20,000 little holes dug out of the surface of our skeleton. And then the bone resorbing cells curl up their toes and die, leaving these holes behind, which are then colonized, if you like, by bone forming cells which come out of the bone marrow space that's overlying it. And those groups of bone forming cells work away over a period of several months and put brand new protein, collagen, in the place where the pockets of old bone were taken away from. And if we look up in the top center of this particular slide, we can see what was probably formerly a deep hole like the one we see at the bottom, but it's now been almost completely refilled by the action of bone forming cells. And this is a cycle of bone turnover which allows us to completely rebuild our skeleton roughly every 10 years or so, and this allows the skeleton to retain its strength. This is a bone resorbing cell studied in a laboratory, and it was settled down on this smooth bone surface about 24 hours before this picture was taken, and it seals itself on the surface of bone a bit the way that a limpet seals itself onto a rock, and you can see that it's been chewing away at the bone, and you can see the individual fibers of the bone, the collagen fibers in bone, waving in the breeze where that bone resorbing cell has been working over the last 24 hours. And this is the next stage in this bone turnover cycle. This is a packet of new bone that's been deposited over the last few months by bone forming cells, and these little black dots across the surface are the bone forming cells that are still working away on making new bone in this particular site across the bone surface. We can put all of this together in a cartoon. So here we see the inactive bone surfaces where there's just some sleeping cells sitting on the surface, and that corresponds to the smooth surfaces we saw on the micrograph of bone a few slides ago. These are the bone resorbing cells chewing away their hole in bone, and then we see now the bone forming cells coming along and beginning to fill in that hole. Here they're putting the protein plug that's going to be the matrix of the new bone, and here the protein plug has been completed, and that then has mineral, which is calcium and phosphate, deposited in it, and 3 or 4 months after the whole process starts, you're right back to where you started. Now this process is a process of renewal, and as I said, allows us to rebuild our skeleton every 10 years. There is a perfect balance in what's depicted here, and that's what occurs during early adult life when you're in your 20s, 30s or 40s. When women transition through the menopause, then levels of sex hormones drop dramatically, and sex hormones are very important in restraining the recruitment of these bone resorbing cells. And so in postmenopausal life there are more of these resorption sites, and the individual resorbing cells tend to dig deeper, and sometimes they dig so deep that they punch a hole right through that bony plate. And if that happens, then there isn't actually a surface anymore for the bone making cells to come and settle down on, and so the process that was meant to be a process of renewal gets cut short at the resorption stage, because if these cells punch right through the bony plate, then there isn't any surface for the bone forming cells to settle down on. Sometimes the resorbing cells don't punch right through, but they dig a deeper hole than they would have done in premenopausal life, and the bone forming cells are unable to completely refill that hole, and so the process of remodeling gets cut short, if you like, at the stage that we see in the bottom right hand corner, where there's been less bone replaced than there was. So this is how bone loss takes place during postmenopausal life, and the same sort of imbalance between resorption and formation also occurs in older men. The process in men probably starts about a decade later. So how does this pan out in the real world? Let's go back to the picture we saw of bone in a healthy young individual, where you've got thick plates of bone well connected with one another. And then let's look at a piece of bone that's been harvested from an individual who has osteoporosis. And it's been processed in exactly the same way, the same magnification and so on. But whereas on the previous picture we saw thick plates of bone well connected with one another, we only see one bony plate here, which is in this bottom left hand corner, and it's somewhat thinner than on the previous slide. In the top left hand corner we can see what was once a bony plate, but the bone resorbing cells have punched a hole right through the middle of it, and so therefore they have transformed that bony plate into a series of more fragile bony struts. And the centre of the picture is taken up by a system of bony struts, and we can see on the surface of this one that there is actually a little hollow sitting on the surface of that strut, almost completely breaking it through. And that hollow is caused by a group of bone resorbing cells that were busy working away, chewing into the bone at the time that this bone sample was taken. And it's not hard to imagine that if the bone sample had been taken a day or two later, within that time, that group of bone resorbing cells probably would have broken completely through that fragment of bone, and therefore completely removed any mechanical value that that piece of bone has in terms of holding the skeleton together. In much the same way as you, if you cut through a piece of scaffolding, you don't need to take large amounts of the scaffolding away, but just actually rupturing one of the scaffolding struts will, of course, completely destroy the mechanical value of the scaffolding. Once bone is no longer bearing a load, then it wastes away, and we can see the next step in this process in the bottom left hand corner, where there's two little spikes of bone that are gradually moving away from one another, having been separated from one another by bone resorbing cells. And the final stage in this process, I guess, is what we see in the bottom right hand corner, where there is no bone at all, that the struts have been ruptured and they've wasted away and there's no bone there at all. So when these pictures became available, perhaps 20 or 30 years ago, the first message that was taken from them was that we should be attempting to prevent postmenopausal bone loss, because it's not just a thinning of bones, it's not a leaching of calcium out of bones, it's an actual loss of the collagen, of the protein structure that makes up the bone. But it's also a destruction of the microarchitecture of bone, and the whole way in which the different bone pieces are held together is interfered with, and therefore the structure of bone is lost. And so we want to prevent this from happening, because it doesn't really matter how clever we get with drugs that might stimulate bone growth. It seems impossible to believe that we would ever have a medicine that would actually make the bone grow back in the shape that it was before. But actually there's another message in this picture as well, and that is that it's never too late to intervene, because even in someone who's lost a lot of bone and had multiple fractures, which was the case with the person from whom this biopsy was taken, there is still bone loss taking place, and there is still damage occurring to the remaining bony structures. And again, as we've said, you don't need much damage to a fragile structure like that to completely remove its mechanical value. So the second message to take from this picture is it's never too late to intervene. And so even in people who've had multiple fractures, it's important to do something to stop the process of bone loss progressing. Someone in her 40s, there is an open meshwork of bony fibres going vertically and horizontally, but that's a fairly strong, robust structure. 10 or 15 years later, you can see more marrow space, which is the darker areas in here, but most of the individual bony components are still there, though there are some holes beginning to develop. Once you get into your 70s, then quite a lot of the individual bony fragments have gone away, particularly the struts that go across the bone, with some accentuation of the remaining vertical struts. By the time a woman is in her 80s, there has been a very substantial loss of the amount of white bone, which we see here in comparison with 40 years earlier. And it's not at all surprising that if your skeleton has this fragile appearance, that if you were to pick up a grandchild or maybe even a heavy shopping basket, that you may actually experience a collapse of that fragile bone when it's not able to bear that extra weight that you're asking it to. And if that your vertebral body does collapse down upon itself, then the person to whom that's happened will get a sharp pain in their back usually, and they will get somewhat shorter, and often the front of the bone tends to collapse down more than the back of the bone, and in that case the person becomes significantly stooped. And so that process of loss of height and stooping as a result of the front of the bone collapsing more than the back produces, if you like, what is the caricature of a little old lady or a little old man, someone who's much shorter and significantly bent in comparison with what they were earlier in life. We can also pan right back and look at the problem of osteoporosis not at the individual bone level but across the whole population. And this has been done in this particular graph, which looks at the distribution of bone density in white women across the age range from 30 out to the age of 90. And the bone density that we define as being osteoporosis is cross-hatched there. So you can see at the age of 30 that there isn't just one normal bone density, there's quite a wide range of bone densities, and they all sit above the level that we would call osteoporosis. By the age of 50, not very much has changed, the distribution's much the same, and there's maybe just the tip of the distribution getting into the osteoporotic range, but it's not a lot different from what it was at the age of 30. But of course menopause on average takes place around the age of 50, and over the following 30 years we can see that the whole population gradually moves down, so that by the time we get to an age of 80, about half of the population have a bone density that sits in the so-called osteoporotic range. There is still a distribution of bone density, and it's pretty much the same shape distribution as it was in premenopausal life. So it's not that bone loss just occurs in some people. Some people have a problem with osteoporosis. Everyone loses bone. If you are lucky enough to have inherited strong bones from your parents, and you start at the top end of the normal range, then even at the age of 80 you can have pretty healthy bones. But if you start at the bottom end of the normal range, then within 10 or 20 or maybe 30 years of the menopause, your bone density is in the osteoporotic range and your risk of fractures is significantly increased. We can actually look at the incidence of fractures, and it's really just the mirror image of what we saw with bone density on the previous slide. So on the right hand side, this is fracture rates in white women in North America, and you can see that hip fractures and spine fractures are pretty uncommon in women in their late 40s and 50s, but forearm fractures, called Colles fractures here, start to steadily climb during the 50s and 60s and then level off in the 70s. Spine fractures or vertebral fractures start to climb during the 60s and steadily go up towards the end of life. Hip fractures start their climb much later, but by the time you're in your mid 70s and beyond, hip fracture rates climb very steeply. And the same is true in men, where hip fracture rates climb very steeply in advanced old age as well. Of course, there are more elderly women around than there are elderly men, because women's life expectancy is 7 or 8 years longer than that of men. But men who do live into their 80s do have a significant risk of hip fracture, and so the issues of fracture prevention and being careful to avert falls apply to men of that age just as much as they do to women. And the two main ways that we have of calculating or assessing someone's fracture risk is to measure their bone density, and also to address a series of fairly simple questions from their past medical history that give us some insight into their future risk of fracture. This is a bone densitometer, so it's just a fancy x-ray really that scans a particular region of the skeleton. In this case, this woman is having her lower spine scanned, It provides a beam of x-rays from underneath the machine that is detected above the machine, and the way that it works is that the more dense your bones are, the stronger your bones are, the fewer x-rays come through, and so the machine can actually calculate that. So we look at the output that's produced from the machine. This is a scan of someone's hip, and here are the densities of the individual regions of the hip, and here those densities are shown in relation to a normal range. And here the lower spine and the same sorts of information that we talked about before. Clinical assessment is more straightforward and much cheaper. The key factors that determine your risk of having a fracture are how old you are. The older you are, the more likely you are to break bones, whatever else is going on in your life. What your body weight is. The heavier you are in general, the less likely you are to fracture. So it's thin people, people who are underweight, who have a higher risk of fracture. If you've had a fracture previously, you're more likely to have a fracture in the future. If you smoke, you increase your risk of fracturing by about 50%. If you've got a family history of osteoporosis, particularly if your parents had, say, hip fractures before the age of 80, then you're more likely to have a hip fracture or some other form of fracture as well. And then there are various medicines and illnesses that increase your risk of fracture, and probably the single most important one of those is glucocorticoid drugs such as prednisone, which is life-saving for many illnesses, but it does take a toll on the skeleton, and so quite often if people need to take glucocorticoid drugs long term, then we will give them medicines to protect their bone from the damaging effects of those drugs. Lots of illnesses also have a negative effect on bone strength. Really anything that anything that causes a chronic inflammatory illness, particularly if it causes you to be underweight, will have a negative effect on your bone health and increase your risk of fracture. If you have a bone density in the lower part of the normal range, then as your bone density goes down, your fracture risk goes up. So it's not just your bone density, and it's not just the presence of risk factors, it's the combination of these that allow us to make a good prediction of your future risk of fracture. And we can now do that online. You can do this yourself using one of the fracture calculator tools, and FRAX is the most common one of these. If you type FRAX into Google, you will be taken to this fracture calculator, and then you can fill in your own clinical criteria, and click on the calculate button, and the program will give you an estimate of your risk of having a major osteoporotic fracture over the next 10 years or of having a hip fracture. Now the actual numbers here don't matter too much, except that they can be compared with standards that have been generally agreed upon as being levels at which we should start getting concerned. And once your 10-year hip fracture risk gets up to about 3%, then most experts consider that's a sensible time to think about taking a medication that will reduce that fracture risk, because a hip fracture risk of about 3% translates into a total fracture risk of about 40% over the next 10 years. Are underweight, and in a woman of average height, this is generally a weight less than, say, 60 kilograms, then they should attempt to put on weight, and this is sometimes difficult in older people to keep their weight up above that level. People who have more than 2 or 3 drinks a day should moderate their intake and keep it at 2 or fewer. People who are at risk of falls need to be specifically investigated as to why they're having falls, and there are specific ways that falls risk can be reduced, say by having grab bars in the bathroom or other places that you're at risk of falling, say on stairs in your home, getting glasses that allow you to see which way you're going, getting rid of loose carpets and cables in your living areas of your home, and then paying attention to the medicines that you're taking, particularly sleeping tablets, which tend to increase individuals' risks of having falls. Safe, careful exercise is a sensible thing to do. That increases the strength of your muscles and the strength of your bones, but it also improves your balance and makes you less likely to fall. People who are having a lot of falls, and this is usually something that applies to very frail older people such as those in rest homes and private hospitals, can actually wear protective pads over their hips so that if they do have a fall, they protect their hip from some of the impact that hitting the ground brings about. In the past, calcium has been strongly advised as a way of preventing bone loss and reducing fractures. In fact, we place a lot less emphasis on this now because the larger studies that have been able to be carried out more recently suggest that the effect of calcium is actually much less than we thought it was. Some of the reason for this is shown in studies such as this. So this is a study that we did in Auckland, in which we followed about 500 or 600 healthy older women over a period of 5 years. We measured their calcium intake a number of times over that 5-year period, and we plotted that out here against the loss of bone density or gain in bone density that occurred over that period of time. And then the lines that are drawn through this graph show us the relationship between change in total amount of bone versus calcium intake. And you can see that that line is completely flat, and what that tells us is that on average the amount of bone being lost by people on high calcium intakes, equivalent to more than 1.5 litres of milk a day, is exactly the same as the amount of bone being lost by the people who take only a glass of milk a day, or its equivalent in terms of calcium. So what the study of bone mass tells us is that the amount of bone that postmenopausal women are losing is really unrelated to the amount of calcium they're taking in their diet. There is other data that supports that. This is a pooling of data from a whole lot of different studies, so involving almost 200,000 people altogether, in which levels of calcium intake from very low up to very high are related to the likelihood of having hip fractures in each of those groups. And you can see that the likelihood of having hip fractures at high calcium intakes is exactly the same as the likelihood of having hip fractures at low calcium intake. So fractures not related to calcium intake either. There are a whole lot of trials that have looked at randomizing people to take either calcium tablets or just placebo or sugar tablets that don't have any calcium in them, and then measured changes in bone density. And this is a pooling of a whole lot of those studies together, and looking at the studies that reported changes in bone density over a period of 1 year. And you can see that, contrary to what I've suggested, perhaps there is a beneficial effect in terms of bone density. The bone density is 1.4% higher in the people taking randomized to take calcium. But if we then follow on with these studies and look at the data at 2 years, and again these are now changes from baseline, we see that the advantage that the people randomized to calcium have is no different at 2 years than it is at 1 year. So there's this small increase of 1% or so in bone density seen at 1 year, but there's no further advantage at the end of 2 years. And indeed the studies that went on for longer than 3 years, we see exactly the same thing, that 1% advantage is still there, but there hasn't been any cumulative advantage as the use of calcium is continuing. And probably a change of only this small magnitude is unlikely to translate into a reduction of fractures. And indeed that's what we see. This is a pooling of data again. These are trials, some of them done a long time ago and some of them done more recently. And the trials have been classified according to how well done they were, and which is substantially influenced by how large they were. And if we just focus on the large studies published over the last 15 years or so, we can see that the average change in fracture rate overlaps this solid line of no effect. And we pull all that data, there really isn't any evidence there that fracture rates have been reduced by randomizing people to take calcium supplements, even if they've carried on taking those supplements over a period of some years. What about the non-bone effects of calcium? Are there side effects from calcium that are a cause for concern? Well, yes, there are, and there's some controversy around this, but the issues where people are concerned is the safety of calcium in relation to tummy upsets. I think it's generally well accepted that calcium supplements do cause constipation, and they often cause quite a lot of wind and bloating. It appears from big trials that calcium increases the risk of kidney stones, probably by about 20%. Which is not a terribly common problem, but it is an issue that we need to balance against the fact that calcium doesn't really seem to do anything good in terms of your bones. And perhaps causing more concern over the last 10 years or so has been evidence that people who take calcium supplements increase their risk of heart attacks, not by much, but by about 20%. And that's a controversial area, but on balance, that most of the data suggests that that is a problem. And indeed, we can see that if we pull data from lots of different trials, we can see that this is again the line of no effect in each of these trials. And in most of the studies, we see that the risk of heart attack seems to be a little bit higher, but not significantly greater than in the people who take placebo. But when we pull all of that data, we see the same effect. But now, once you've pulled data across about almost 30,000 people, there is actually a significant increase in the risk of that. And if we look at the timeline of this, we see that really within a year of starting on calcium supplements, there seems to be more heart attacks, and that those two lines gradually diverge over time. So the implications for practice are that we don't really think that people need to place a huge emphasis on the amount of calcium that they're having. Probably 500 milligrams, half a gram a day is enough, and that's equivalent of maybe a glass or two of milk, or some equivalent other dairy product or non-dairy source of calcium. There's also calcium in other things such as bony fish, such as tofu, dark vegetables, such as spinach or broccoli, for instance, and so that we can obtain our calcium from a variety of different sources. We advise people to get their calcium from food, not from taking supplements, which don't seem to be safe, nor are they effective. And really we're de-emphasizing the whole role of calcium in terms of fracture prevention. Another factor that's related to bone health is vitamin D, and vitamin D got the wrong name 100 years ago when it was identified. It is not a vitamin, because a vitamin is something that we have to get in our diet. Vitamin D is a substance that we make in our skin as a result of exposure to sunlight. And so the people who become vitamin D deficient are those who don't expose their skin to sunlight. So these are frail elderly people who never venture outdoors, women who are permanently veiled, and people with very dark skin who are living away from in non-sunny environments. And so the pigment in very dark skin absorbs the energy from the sunlight, which is used to make vitamin D, and so very dark skin makes a lot less vitamin D than otherwise. We can see the dependence of vitamin D levels on sunshine exposure when we look at vitamin D levels across the year. So this is data from women in Auckland, and we can see that when the sunshine levels are highest, and the sunshine levels throughout the year are shown with the dotted line, that the vitamin D levels shown in the solid line are also highest. And then, so that's sort of February, March, end of summer, the vitamin D levels are highest, and then about August at the end of winter they're lowest and creep back up again. And so vitamin D, severe vitamin D deficiency is more likely to occur towards the end of winter, but as I said before, it's much more likely to occur in people who never go outside and don't get that sunshine exposure. We store vitamin D in our fat tissue, and so we have a slow release form of vitamin D, if you like, that from that storage depot. And so if we get lots of sun during the warm months of the year, the fact we're not getting a lot of sun in the middle of winter is not much of a problem, because we usually have enough vitamin D stored up to carry us. To the left of the vertical line, then it suggests it's having a negative effect. And so this is pooling all of the studies that have ever been done giving vitamin D compared with inactive tablets, and looking at effect on bone density. And you can see when you add all of those studies together, 23 different studies at the time we did this analysis, absolutely no effect on bone density whatsoever. And if you go on and look at fractures, and this is again a pooling of the various fracture data, and again we see a scattering of the results to the right and left of the line of no effect, and overall we see no effect. So giving vitamin D in the studies that have been done to date makes no difference to bone density, or it seems to fractures. But we know that very low levels of vitamin D do interfere with bone health and actually cause bone pain and muscle weakness. And so in a more recent study, we carefully, in which we gave people in the population vitamin D or inactive tablets, placebo tablets, and we measured their bone density over 2 years. And then we carefully went back through the database to see if we could identify a baseline level of vitamin D below which vitamin D had a beneficial effect. And if we start with the right-hand panel, here we see different sites at which we've measured bone density. We see the change in bone density over 2 years in the inactive tablet-treated people, that's the white line, and the change in bone density over 2 years in those given vitamin D. And you can see there's no meaningful difference across those different sites of measurement in the people whose baseline levels of vitamin D was above 30 nanomoles per litre. And that's a pretty low level. The vast majority of people living independent lives in most of New Zealand will have levels greater than 30. The average up and down the country is more like 50. But what we do see is that the small number of people who started with values less than 30, if they weren't given active treatment, they lost a couple of % of bone density in the 2 years of the study, and if they were given vitamin D, that loss was completely prevented. So I think what this does is it allows us to say that there is a level below which we shouldn't let our vitamin D levels go, because our skeleton will suffer if we do, but it's actually a very low level, and probably we can identify the people who had these very low levels by the factors I've talked about before. So almost never going outside, being permanently veiled, having very dark skin, and so on. Okay, so let's now move on and talk about what we can do to actually treat osteoporosis in the people who are found to have a high fracture risk and a low bone density. And this is now a cartoon taking us back to the bone surface, and it's really just repeating some of what we've said before. Here we have a bone resorbing cell, an osteoclast, about to start digging holes in bone. Buried in the bone we have osteocytes, which are cells that have little processes that extend from one osteocyte to the other and up to the bone surface, and they detect the stresses and strains that are being placed on bone, and they can control bone formation and bone resorption in response to those stresses and strains. And they exert that control by making proteins that are secreted at the bone surface, and they can switch on osteoclasts and they can switch off osteoblasts. And so these proteins give us give the bone the capacity to respond to the loads that are placed upon it. Over here we see a hollow that's been dug out by osteoclasts previously, and then over the last few months has been filled in by osteoblasts, and we can see these nice square osteoblasts drawn on the surface. So in essence, the ways in which we can make our bone stronger are by using medicines that switch off osteoclasts, switch off bone resorbing cells, or switch on osteoblast bone forming cells, or possibly medicines that actually do both of those. So the most widely used medicines for treating osteoporosis are called the bisphosphonates. The ones that are used in New Zealand for treating osteoporosis are risedronate, alendronate, and zoledronate. Risedronate and alendronate are given in tablet forms, usually once a week, and zoledronate is given as an infusion, so that's a needle is popped into a vein, usually in the back of the hand, and then the medicine is trickled in over a period typically of about 15 minutes. And we give that every 1 to 3 years, depending on where your particular issues are, what your bone density is, and how severe the osteoporosis, and how many doses you've had before. So the bisphosphonates target bone, and they have a negative charge on each of those molecules because of the cluster of oxygen atoms that are down one end of the molecule, and the surface of bone has a positive charge because it's covered in calcium ions, and so the bisphosphonates stick like crazy to the surface of bone. And this is an experiment done with a rat, and the bisphosphonate that was given to this rat has got a radioactive label in it, so it shows up as a little white dot. Each piece of bisphosphonate shows up as a little white dot. And so in the top part here we see a picture taken an hour after a rat's had an injection of this radioactive bisphosphonate, and you can see that the skeleton is already extensively labelled, and the soft tissue in the chest and the abdomen here, there's basically no bisphosphonate in soft tissue, except in the kidney. And what this tells us is that when you give an intravenous bisphosphonate, within an hour or two, half of it's already in the skeleton and the other half is being excreted through the kidney into the urine and out of the body, and there's really no circulating bisphosphonate left in the system except in the skeleton within a day or so of administration. And then the bottom part of this graph is equally, or this picture is equally interesting, because we see a rat a year after it's had its dose of bisphosphonate, and we can see the skeleton is still heavily labelled, though of course the soft tissues show no trace of bisphosphonate. So what this is telling us is that bisphosphonates go straight to the skeleton and they stay there for a long time, and that's why they have such a long duration of action. And once they're in the skeleton, they interfere with the activity of the bone resorbing cells. And so this is another experiment with a labelled bisphosphonate. We have a bone surface here, and it's been treated with a bisphosphonate that's got a green label on it, so we can see all the bisphosphonates sitting at the bone surface along here. And this blue halo here is a bone resorbing cell, and it was settled down on this bone surface on the right hand side there about 24 hours before this picture was taken, and we can see that the bone resorbing cell has dug a shallow hole out of the bone surface, and in the process it's taken lots of this green label bisphosphonate inside the cell, and there it is, stuffed full of green bisphosphonate, and that bisphosphonate interferes with the activity of the bone resorbing cell and stops it resorbing any more bone. So the bone resorbing cell is lifting off the surface of bone. It's moved along a little bit, but it hasn't resorbed any bone at this site. So the bisphosphonates are medicines that go to the bone surface, they stick there, stay there for a long time, and they give substantial protection to the underlying bone against resorption by bone resorbing cells. So they effectively rebalance the bone formation, bone resorption seesaw, which gets unbalanced at the time of menopause, and so they stop us losing more bone, and as we'll see, they actually reduce the risk of having fractures. So this is just now going to humans, showing that the same sorts of things work. This is a study with the intravenous bisphosphonate, zoledronate, and so it's given as injections once a year in this particular study. And what's been measured in patients treated with zoledronate, shown in orange, and in patients given no active treatment, shown in white, is a biochemical measure of bone resorption activity. And so in those who weren't treated, bone resorption activity trucks on at the level that it was at the beginning of the study, but it's substantially inhibited, probably by about 3/4, in the people who are given the bisphosphonate, zoledronate, and it stays low for the duration of time that the treatment is continued. And in response to that decrease in bone resorption, we see an increase in bone density, and this is comparisons of long-term studies now over 9 years or so with 3 different drugs. Alendronate, sometimes called Fosamax, which has been the most widely used bisphosphonate taken in tablet form. Zoledronate, which is the intravenous form that we talked about, appears to cause slightly bigger increases in bone density, but both of them plateau off after about 3 to 5 years, and then bone density just remains at that higher level, but fracture rates do remain low. And then a new drug, which is just coming into use in New Zealand, though it's been fairly widely used elsewhere over the last 5 years or so, is called denosumab, and that works by switching off bone resorption, but it doesn't bind to the surface of bone. It actually interferes with one of the proteins that are made within bone that lead to the activation of bone resorbing cells, and so it switches off the recruitment and activity of bone resorbing cells. So it ultimately has the same effect in terms of decreasing bone resorption that we see with the bisphosphonates, though its mechanism of action is somewhat different, and it also causes rapid increases in bone density initially, which then plateau off, though they do seem to continue on somewhat longer than we see with the bisphosphonate medicines. So this is now a summary of a lot of the medicines that have been used for treating osteoporosis, looking at their effects on fracture. And this picture is the same as the others I've shown you, so the line of no effect is that vertical dotted line there. And so calcium, vitamin D and their combination don't have any effect on non-vertebral fracture. The agents we have available in New Zealand have got boxes around them, so here we have alendronate and risedronate. They reduce spine fractures, that's vertebral fractures, by about 1/2, but non-vertebral fractures they only reduce by about 20 or 30%, so that's better than nothing, but it's certainly not a cure for the problem. Zoledronate, again about a 25–30% reduction. Raloxifene is available in New Zealand. It reduces spine fractures. It doesn't have any effect on hip fractures or on other non-vertebral fractures. The new drug, denosumab, which binds to the factor that turns on bone resorption, also has about the same capacity to prevent fractures as the bisphosphonates that I've talked about. That's given by an injection under the skin every 6 months. And then teriparatide works quite differently from the other factors we've talked about, in that it switches on bone formation rather than switching off bone resorption. So the idea is that it will bring the balance about, but do it by pushing up bone formation so that it is as big as, or hopefully greater than, rates of bone resorption. And this appears to be quite effective in reducing fracture numbers, though its effectiveness in preventing hip fractures has not really been conclusively demonstrated. Also, teriparatide is given as an injection under the skin every day, and it costs quite a lot of money, about $5,000 or $1,000 or so each year, and so the Pharmac restricts the number of people who can have access to teriparatide to those with particularly severe osteoporosis, because it's more hassle to give and it's a lot more expensive, whereas the other agents we've talked about, alendronate and rosedronate, are less than $100 a year these days. So how do we use these medicines in the long term? And I've just put a graph up here, or a plan of how we use alendronate, because that probably has been the most widely used intervention. So typically when we decide that someone should take alendronate, we'd advise them to take it, say, for 5 years before having a major reappraisal and determining whether it's sensible to press on. And at that time, and 5 years is not written in stone, it might be 3 or 4, or it might be a little bit longer. At that time it's sensible to have a remeasure of bone density, and DEX is the abbreviation for the bone density measurement, and a measurement of whether of a factor in serum called P1NP, which is one of the factors we can measure in blood that tell us whether the rate of bone resorption has indeed been damped down. Now, we don't need to go through this in great detail, but essentially those assessments and talking about whether you've had fractures or not will bring us to a couple of different conclusions. If bone densities come up really well and if bone resorption has come down, then probably people can come off their medicine for a while, and this is what we refer to as a drug holiday. And how long that holiday should be depends on what your remaining fracture risk is, and how well you are in relation to other medical problems. But typically with alendronate, people would come off and perhaps stay off drug for a couple of years and then get reappraised. And if everything's remaining stable and if bone resorption is remaining low because there's still enough medicine sitting at the bone surface, then the holiday may even be prolonged beyond a couple of years. But often after 1 or 2 years off, it's sensible to go back on. If bone resorption hasn't been reduced, and often we measure the serum P1NP within about 6 months of starting on one of these tablet medications to make sure it is working, then changing from a tablet medication to zoledronate, the medicine that can be given into a vein, is a good option to make sure that the medicine is getting into your system and able to switch off bone resorption. And sometimes bone density remains really quite low and fracture risk remains high, and so sometimes we would then, even after 5 years, continue on the medicine for a longer period of time, maybe for another 2 or 3 years. But often in that case with alendronate, it's possible to reduce the dose and only give it every couple of weeks rather than giving it every week. So there are variations around that thing, but in general we like to give people a period of time off the bisphosphonate medications after about 5 years or so, really because the medicine builds up at the bone surface and it's not necessary to keep on giving it every year, because you can get some significant carryover benefit from the medicine that you've already taken in the past. So how long should a drug holiday be? Alendronate can be as long as 5 years, typically 1 to 2 years. Rosedronate, which is another tablet medicine, wears off rather more quickly, so typically if people are having time off that, we would make that 6 to 12 months. Denosumab, which is the 6-monthly injection under the skin I talked about, is not a bisphosphonate. It does not have this carry-over effect, and so it's very important to continue having those injections promptly every 6 months, And if people want to come off denosumab, they need to transition onto one of the other medicines, alendronate, risedronate, or zoledronate, because otherwise the effect of denosumab can wear off very, very quickly. All the bone density that's been gained can be lost, and indeed some people have clusters of fractures if they just stop denosumab suddenly. But as I said, denosumab is not very much used in New Zealand at the present time, so that's not a major problem at present. The intravenous medicine, zoledronate, we tend to start giving it every 18 months initially, and if bone density is going up and people are remaining without fractures, then we tend just to gradually space out those infusions so that eventually we're giving the injections every 2 to 3 years or even less frequently, and just to continue to give doses from time to time to keep the bone resorbing cells at a low level of activity, and we can measure that, as I said, by the blood tests. Teriparatide, the medicine that we give every day, we only can give that for periods of 18 months, and that's a government regulation that constrains us in that regard. But its effects will wear off too after it's been stopped, and so it's important to follow that up with one of the other medicines we've talked about to lock in the benefits that are accrued, and it's sensible to have a plan for transitioning to that other medicine before we actually start on the teriparatide. So let's sum up then. These are the main medicines that we have available in New Zealand for treating osteoporosis. The bisphosphonates are very effective at reducing spine or vertebral fractures, non-vertebral fractures and hip fractures. If you take them in tablet form, then people will get gastrointestinal side effects, so they can get some indigestion. It's important to take them with water alone first thing in the morning before you have anything else to eat, and to wait at least half an hour before you have your breakfast, and to stay upright during that time. That doesn't mean you have to be standing, but you should be standing or sitting or walking, because if you lie down, the tablets can sometimes trickle back up into the gullet, into the esophagus, and cause some heartburn. If you have intravenous bisphosphonates, it's important that your kidneys are working well beforehand, because if we give those infusions to people with sick kidneys, it can make them much, much sicker. And there is concern with long-term use that they may start causing some atypical fractures, particularly in the thigh, and an extremely rare condition called osteonecrosis of the jaw, which it really probably doesn't matter in the context of osteoporosis treatment. It's more a problem that we see in people who have cancers that have spread to the bone. But the concern about causing unusual fractures in the thigh bone is the reason that we're keen not to carry the drugs on without a break for more than 5 to 10 years at a time. Denosumab is the injection that I've talked about, you give under the skin every 6 months, also very effective at preventing fractures. It has the same rare side effects of potentially causing unusual fractures in the femur, but again that's extremely rare. Main reason for being concerned about being careful in the use of denosumab is its rapid offset of effects, and the fact that you can get multiple spine fractures in a few percent of people who just suddenly stop their medicines. Teriparatide, the injection, abbreviated here as PTH, good at decreasing vertebral and non-vertebral fractures. It is expensive, it requires daily injections, and we're not really sure that it can prevent hip fractures. Vitamin D we've talked about. It's sensible to try and keep levels above a level of about 40 nanomoles per litre. In practice we don't usually measure the vitamin D levels. We either give a small supplement in people who are seldom getting outdoors, or if people are regularly outdoors and exposed to sunshine, then we don't need to do anything specific about that. So take-home messages: it's sensible to have a bone density measurement in women in their 60s, even if they've never had problems before. If they've had fractures, or if they've got a family history of fractures, then we would perhaps do that earlier, perhaps in the 50s. Men we don't usually screen at that time of life, but in the 70s that may be a reasonable thing to do. We should look to a balanced diet that maintains a healthy body weight for our calcium supply, and not use calcium supplements. But vitamin D supplements are very cheap, very easy to take and safe, and can be used in frail elderly people who are not getting outdoors. The potent bisphosphonates, so that's alendronate, risedronate tablets, So lead drenate injections are the mainstay of treatment at the present time, and in those who've got particularly severe disease or continue to have fractures even when they've been on one of the bisphosphonate medicines, then we use one of the PTH related medicines, and Teriparatide is the one we have available in this country at the present time. Denosumab is well tolerated, people don't get the side effects from it, but it is very important to have the injections regularly and not have big lags after the 6-month due date. And there's a new class of medicines I haven't talked about, which are not yet available in New Zealand, but they're called anti-sclerostin drugs, and they're very potent ways of stimulating bone formation, and we're looking to those in the future as a way of reducing fracture risk in people with severe osteoporosis, probably giving them for a fixed period of time to build up more bone and then following them with these other medicines we've talked about as a way of locking that in. So thank you for your attention. I hope this has been helpful to you, and Osteoporosis New Zealand is available to provide advice and help if there are specific issues, but of course your first port of call probably is to talk to your doctor if you've got specific issues about your own healthcare in relation to osteoporosis. Thanks and goodbye.